more or less like you just said, not being able to measure your performance. So building on that insight, I'm going to get Professor Kenneth to now touch and provide us with his opening around what this means for Lagos State, for their new development plans that they've just set up right now, and the linkage with SDGs, and how best they can actually start tracking progress. Professor Amechi, over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I think the first speaker has set a very good perspective to the conversation, and I'll take it forward from there. So we know that data is important for the SDGs in particular, and the SDGs themselves are there to, as global goals, and they are meant to be achieved by 2030, all things being equal. But the challenge for different entities, including state government and national government and even corporates, is to think about the possibility of meeting those goals. And in order to meet them, we need to measure them, because what we can't manage, what we can measure. So tracking is very important. And in order to get to tracking and measurements, you need good data. But whilst data is important, we also need to be careful and also understand some of the political dimensions of data. So we agree data is important, but oftentimes we miss the political undertones, because data can be used for different things, right? So, so in that regard, it's important to understand and emphasize that both data and measurement are contested spaces. So Lagos will provide data, for example, but who scrutinize the data? Companies provide data on SDG, but who is scrutinizing what companies are producing? So to what extent can we link what companies are doing through their sustainability reporting to what the government expects? Say, for example, a company might train 300 women and they come out and say, we have contributed to SDG 5. To what extent can we believe that? So that idea of measurement needs to have the validity as well as the reliability. But there needs to be someone or an entity or group of people who are scrutinizing both what companies are producing and what the government is producing. So in that regard, in order to be more pragmatic and practical, we also need to think about the link between what happens at the corporate level, individual level, as well as the state level. And that's where I would anticipate that government or Lagos state government can play a very significant role to identify what is already done, so by identifying the priority areas for Lagos, but also providing the data that will enable corporates to match their activities, especially corporates in Lagos, to match their activities to those of Lagos State. And that's always the missing gap. And even if you look at it from a national context, that's one of the problems that the SDGs are facing at the moment. That's the link between micro activities and macro expectations. But data themselves also help governments in terms of governing, because with good data, you'll be able to put in place the appropriate measures and policies to guide your activities. It's also good for business, right? The business can then decide and prioritize, because companies, the ones I interact with, oftentimes sit alone thinking through the SDGs to prioritize. And if they don't have good information to help them, they are likely to prioritize based on what they consider to be present for their business and based also on the information they have. So data is good to enable companies set good targets that would align to the kind of society Lagos State is looking for. It will also help the civil society organizations, because they need to have something to hold both government and businesses to account. But if they don't have good data, what's the evidence then for them to play their role as watchguards in society? So, so the point I'm trying to make is, as much as we want to think about data and the relevance of data, let us also be careful to think about the fact that data themselves can be contested. And again, how do we know where we are with our data is a key question to consider. And also, the SDGs might be providing some frameworks or they provide some frameworks to enable both companies and governments to measure. But we also need to step back a bit and understand that the frameworks themselves are not neutral. The frameworks are shaped and curated by some people and with some interests. So we need to be sure that the sustainable SDG frameworks are not distracting us from the sustainability agenda, because we run the risk of equating SDGs to sustainability, whereas it might be something else. And you may find companies who choose, out of the 17 goals, they may choose to focus on 5 or 6, and they come back and say, oh, we've done the SDGs. But so in that regard, they have been distracted. So what is meant to be a good thing, in a way, by helping companies frame their activities, might produce unintended consequences. So I've read these polemics, just to enable us position things and not just see the SDGs and the frameworks and the data as good in themselves. They are good and helpful, but they are a means to an end. And I thought it would be nice to kind of contextualize the conversation so that it helps us in our framing of the problem and the solutions that will come out of it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. That's a very insightful contribution. And as Prof mentioned, it's about data, it's about ensuring the integrity of the data collection process. And also, data can be quite political. So the key question then really is that, how do we ensure that we have the right set of data and we can derive necessary analysis and information from that data? I don't know whether Dr. Yemi Kale is on right now. Dr. Yemi Kale. Dr. Yemi Kale. Okay, I think in the absence of Dr. Kale from the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics that will give us insight on the data, I will ask Mrs. Sima Sholoton to provide opening statement. Mrs. Sholoton, she's a Director of Sustainability with IHS Towers. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Olu, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. From the private sector, sustainability reporting is one area that I would say most private sector organizations are currently looking at, working towards, and improving on. But we haven't seen much from the public sector when it comes to actual, collection of data around, be it the SDGs, be it around various sustainability related indicators. And then, like what Prof said, the whole idea at the end of the day is not just about collecting data, but it's about the decisions that come out of data. And for the public sector, it's all about public value. It's all about the value that they need to create for the public. While we expect the public sector to measure, to report on various sustainability indicators based on the work that they're doing or aspirations that they have, I think it's also important to note that we can't necessarily compare the public sector reporting and private sector reporting, because we really have separate, but I would say sometimes interrelated agenda. So like I've said, for the public sector, it's really all about ensuring that it's more around the public value, public policy, while still creating the right policies and activities for its populace. So what really drives, or what should drive the public sector reporting? It should be issues around, for instance, political pressure, international agreements, the kinds of things that drive its trading relationships, targets, need to cost, and other things like that, unlike the private sector, which is really driven by legal requirements and industry standards. So in this conversation, I would like us to really set that context to see that while private sector and public sector, we need to report as regards sustainability imperatives. However, we just need to be very conscious of the fact that public sector reporting may be slightly different from what the private sector would focus on. But in general, we're working towards the same goals. I expect that the private sector reporting would also feed into what the public sector reports at the end of the day. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Charlton, for that context. And as she rightly pointed out, private sector reporting on sustainability is quite different from public sector. As we all know, there are various reporting standards for private sector, such as GRI, and there are initiatives on sustainability accounting standards, and also efforts to look futuristic, talking about integrated reporting, in which proponents are considering for private sector to report based on integrated risk return and impact, in which rather than to have separate sustainability reporting, you can have this to be integrated. However, as she pointed out, for public sector reporting, there are certain political dimension to data reporting. And would have been nice to get the insight from Dr. Kale, who is apparently unavoidably absent. But in terms of the political dimension of data, it is actually quite important for public sector to strengthen the data collection process, because data are facts, and whatever developmental planning that is required needs to be backed up with data. For instance, who pays for the cost of baseline data, in which you can have an understanding of metrics to track your developmental plan? And because once you have a baseline data, and when you are making progress, it's easier to now see that you've actually made incremental progress, or you're not making progress at all. So that's why it is important on the public sector reporting. I will move on to the other panelist, Mr. Olumide from Nigerian Stock Exchange. Oh, I understand that Mr. Olumide is also not available, so that means the rest of the panelists will have plenty of time to provide insight. We were hoping that Mr. Olumide will provide insights on how Lagos State can actually assess funding through sustainability reporting. So I will probably provide a brief of an insight in that regard, because I'm familiar with the efforts of the Nigerian Stock Exchange to attract long-term patient capital, especially for infrastructure finance. And one of the things that is required really is this. Like the first speaker mentioned, Dr. Shino, what measures get done? And since we are looking at the agenda for the next 10 years, it is actually vital to know that there is tremendous finance available for the SDGs. And I guess that's why everybody is talking about SDGs over the next 10 years. However, for you to attract that SDG financing, you need to also demonstrate your ability to report on the SDGs. So the SDGs, has been said, really, they are like common set of objectives and metrics to be able to track progress in addressing the social and environmental issues that have not been addressed by the private sector. And building on what Professor Kenneth also said, sustainability in itself is not just about SDGs. We need to understand that sustainability is on the concept of the triple bottom line. That is financial, economic, and the economic part, the social and environmental. So you need to ensure that as you are reporting on economic, you're also integrating this along your social and environmental dimension. So it is actually important for Lagos State that has now developed a teams plan. How can then, using sustainability measurement and reporting, Lagos State will attract investment to fund some of these long-term projects? So I will start with this context, and I will revert back to Dr. Shino to provide insight in terms of, from a finance point of view, what is the linkage? What should Lagos State be doing to align their reporting to be able to attract the much needed sustainable finance? Over to you, Dr. Shino.
Thank you very much. You know, in development financing and the development space, the currency that attracts financing is development results. The only way you can demonstrate development results if you are tracking those results. Now, what we need to do is to get away from this mindset of tracking activities. When tracking data itself doesn't mean anything. You have to process data to be able to extract information out of it. So it's not just tracking data. And when we say, if you want to attract SDG funding and sustainability, sustainable development funding, that means we have to have an agenda that is consistent with the global agenda. For example, if you have an agenda on climate change, you have an agenda on environmental protection, you have an agenda on social justice and social integration. There are several pockets of funding. There's plenty of funding for that. However, you have to be able to develop a peculiar results framework for your own state. So let's say, for example, that Lagos State's own development agenda is couched in the LSDPC. That agenda itself must have a results framework that identifies indicators, not just data. If you're going to sew an agbada, the kind of measurements you will take will be different from if you want to sew a suit. So it's not just data. So Lagos State has to collect a body of indicators that reflect where Lagos State wants to be in another 20 years. And it must do it in a manner, and you can borrow indicators that are already they're already defined through platforms and frameworks like SDG framework. I am not saying that Lagos State should just dump the SDG framework as its own. It has its own development agenda. That development agenda should throw up a results framework. That results framework will help it to capture indicators. That results framework will help it to point out where it needs to move and provide the evidence. That evidence is what is going to be tabled before international funding and international finance to be able to gain and elicit support. Some of the data that will come out of there also will be integrated to private sector. And I want to say, with all due respect to my colleagues that are from the private sector, sustainability is sustainability. It's even beneficial for private sector now to be more conscious of sustainability. And there is a whole raft of new industries. There's a whole green industry. Tesla is the entire Tesla issue, the product is entirely based on sustainability, renewable energy to drive automobiles. So what we need to do is to now track within our private companies and say, okay, towards carbon emissions, we are compliant to this extent. Towards renewable energy, we are compliant to this extent. In terms of protecting work-life balance for our workers and our staff, we are compliant to this extent. Because all those parameters make the productivity of all the resources you deploy into your companies. That's the rate of return. Now, in private sector and pure banking, called pure commercial balance, we look at rate of returns, we look at the money bottom line. But for sustainability, it's a triple bottom line, not just a cash bottom line, and not just a balance sheet bottom line. And this is where we have to migrate our thinking as well, whether it be private sector, whether we be in Lagos. I would suggest to Lagos State, very, very sincerely and honestly, that they should review the LSDPC. I mean, look, it's already 2012. It was launched in 2012. It's gone how many years? It's 8 years. How do we make it more consistent with our future aspirations? How do we make it more consistent? The themes agenda, for example, we have to fold that in the LSDPC, maybe extend the LSDPC to another 30 years to end with the Sustainable Development Goals. From the LSDPC, we can track strategic objectives which will have indicators that speak to all the issues on sustainability, whether it's in economic growth, whether it's in finance, whether it's in the environment. And Lagos State has a major environment need to track indicators. So I think when we have the frameworks and the parameters and we are producing the results, right? And just as the lady said, it's not just about having the data. Decisions have to be made on this. Not only financial decisions, budgetary decisions in terms of progress, you want to change course. So how do those indicators get to the governor? How do they get to the state exco? Every ministry in Lagos State has a Department of Planning, Research and Statistics. And that should be the bedrock. You also have the Bureau for Statistics. Now, it is not just, now we have to change the way we do it. It's not just going out to look for the data now. Let us go out to look for the data that is consistent with international best practice. The data that will actually measure the uniqueness of Lagos State. So we don't have to carry the whole bundle of indicators. Let us look for a basket that is unique to us. When we present ourselves like this before any international, because it's a global finance and international development, the most important goal for me now and for Lagos State now is the last goal, Goal 17, which is about building partnerships. Lagos must build partnerships with the private sector. You must build partnerships with the civil society. But if you ask me what program we should develop that will encompass a lot and will attract funding, security and justice, SDG 17. You have to design a program in a one governance, with a one governance mindset to track security and justice. Because how do you get funding? How do you attract funding in Lagos if you don't pursue with rigor and vigor the security and justice situation? So for me, it's about getting prepared in your processes, going in the right direction, and being on the same page and on the same parameters as the development funding globally. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Shina, for that context. And you are quite spot on, really, in the sense that to attract developmental finance, it is important for Lagos State to have structured reporting to be able to do this. And you have also highlighted the need for Lagos State to update the development plans and possibly to link it with the SDG 10-year frame of 2020, so they can track it alongside with SDGs. And one of the things that you've also mentioned, which is very important, like for instance, we were hoping to get insight from Dr. Kale, the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. While national data is key, but it's also extremely important for subnationals to develop their capacity to gather data within the state planning and statistics ministry. So these are some of the recommendations. So building up on this, Professor Kenneth is an international scholar. He's advised a lot of organizations in terms of what kind of policy that can be in place for organizations, both public, private, even philanthropy, to achieve that objective. So we want you to build on this and provide insight from a policy dimension. What kind of policy should Lagos State needs to put in place to achieve that, okay, there is a structured sustainability measurement and reporting not only for the state, but also for tax-paying businesses in the state, for instance. So over to you, Professor Kenneth.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, again, building on a very good point made by my colleague earlier. I would like to summarize or bring my conversation to build a conversation around 4 themes. The first one is what I may call the localization, indigenization. So the SDG data are global. The SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals are global. But we need to indigenize, we need to localize. Say, for example, poverty in Lagos means different thing for, say, poverty in Edinburgh or London or New York. So to what extent can we domesticate that conversation when it comes to measurement and data? So like you said, data is not just sufficient, and tracking is not sufficient as well. It's also about outcomes. So again, if you take the goals and domesticate them, that's what I may call the localization of the SDGs. The second point I will make, which may also help to inform policy in Lagos State, for example, is the idea of democratization of data. And that is important. You remember I started with the fact that data is political. So who controls the data? And you also asked the question, who pays for it? So at the moment, it's very much centralized. So official data in Nigeria, to a large extent, are curated by the National Bureau of Statistics. Probably also the Lagos State Bureau of Statistics has some kind of regulatory mandate to be the official signpost for data. But what happened is that whether we are looking at it at the national level or regional or sub-national level, is the fact that there is a kind of lag between data point A and data point B. To what extent can we quicken that process by democratizing data collection in such a way that even citizens, leveraging their mobile phones and other technologies, can contribute to data? So the role of the regulator or the government agency becomes one of synchronization of data, making sure that the data coming from different sources through multiple actors are sanitized, and that they meet also certain validity and reliability criteria. So they become more like gatekeepers, but providing the necessary framework to enable multiple actors to participate in that data generation. So it becomes a form of democratization. And then the role becomes synchronization. Then the fourth part I want to talk about, which links to what Lagos is known for as kind of center for excellence and also center for technological improvement and development. And the fact also that you have a lot of young people who are now technology savvy. To what extent can we technologize our data? So how do we create and leverage the existing technologies, or even encourage entrepreneurs who can go into this space and they can, we talk about fintech. Can we begin to also talk about data tech or infotech, information technology in the true sense of it? So moving from data to information that will be meaningful for decision making. So once we begin to steer the conversation and drive the narrative towards the importance of data and the role technology plays in data collection and gathering, then it might also open up new avenue for entrepreneurship. Because as he pointed out, we may not be looking for new data. The data may just be there, but the technology and the processes for harnessing the data are not maybe where we are lacking. So how can we leverage technologies in new ways? It might be geospatial data, it might be even data people can collect from their phones, and the whole revolution around the big data agenda, where companies are using it to understand their customers better, and they can also use it in different new ways. So I'm thinking that the technologization of data is very important. Then the final point I want to make there is the idea of what I call the financialization of data. And financialization here means, money needs to flow in. We're talking about money that or finance for the SDGs or finance for sustainability. We may also, once you have the technology and it's thriving, the ecosystem is booming, it's able then to drive money into it. That's what I call the financialization. Money follows needs and investors follow opportunities. So how do we bring all these things together? And a good example of a technology-led organization that has benefited from this data culture is Budget. Budget came out of its co-creation hub, and you can see what they're doing in the public sector space of providing data that will enable people to scrutinize and hold government to account. Imagine taking that idea to other SDGs where we create entrepreneurs or create opportunities for entrepreneurs to provide the data that could also be financialized, that will create benefit and other values for the stakeholder. So I'm thinking in the sense that if you are looking at Lagos State and the policy Lagos State can make, Lagos State doesn't need to be too draconian, because sometimes also regulation can backfire. So if you create a common standard that becomes too difficult to implement, it might be quite difficult. So I would think there is a blend and a conversation to be had between soft and hard regulations. So that way, the government can create more of incentives that will enable companies and other actors to participate in, first, in data generation, second, in terms of the technological entrepreneurship that is required to create a viable data ecosystem, and thirdly, the idea of money following the entrepreneurship, and where the government then plays the role of synchronization of the different interests and capabilities. This is happening in other countries. So think about the development in artificial intelligence, where governments are leveraging behavioral science to understand people more, address issues. Think about the role of satellite technology in collecting data, mapping out deforestation, issues to do with ocean levels, how the global warming and so on are progressing. So that's where technology is very important, and we need to invest in that. And also think about Lagos State working with, say, Lagos State University or University of Lagos to create a sophisticated data research center that will support the ecosystem. So there is a good relationship there between town and town, where we are thinking about the relationship between industry, government, and academia. So I think for me, from a policy perspective, these are some of the things I'll be thinking of if I were at Lagos State. So let me stop here and give others time to talk.
Yeah, that's excellent submission, Prof. And like Riley mentioned, Prof highlighted 5 things. The need to domesticate the SDGs, that is, localize it within an environment. Even though the SDGs are global goals, we can find a way to do that. And I think Lagos State has taken the right steps to align the team's agenda, which is the local metrics to measure in terms of progress of Lagos State with the SDGs. And we also talked about the democratization of data to synchronization. But I want to emphasize his last point on technology, data and technology. And from a policy perspective, we all know about the big data AI, as Prof rightly mentioned. There is need to actually close the gap, because within our research institutions, specifically what Lagos State needs to be doing really is a sort of funding the capabilities of the research institutions that will look at having data centers in which you actually have an automation. You are looking for statistics on poverty in Lagos State. You are looking for analyze security in Lagos State, crime statistics, or you are looking to look at the environmental statistics in terms of baseline benchmarking data. This should be something that can be readily available. And of course, it can be done through public-private partnership in terms of ownership. So I'm going to build up on this to get Mrs. Sholaton to provide insight from a private sector point of view. There's always the conversation that a lot of private organizations, they have their CSR unit, and yet you spend a lot of money in actually tracking the progress of the CSR, whether it's actually making contributions or you have the right return on investment on your CSR. So the question then really is that how can the private sector partner with Lagos State around the area of using technology for data collection, data tracking, and data analysis, such that it becomes quite easy for you to have any indicators that you need in Lagos State just by just going onto a technology platform, and it could also be an opportunity to create huge opportunities for the youth. Mrs. Charlton.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I was thrown out for a while, and I just got back in. Please, can you take the question again?
Okay. Professor Kenneth mentioned on the importance of using technology for data collection and analysis. And it mentioned around big data, artificial intelligence. And the question really is that how can the private sector partner with Lagos State in this area of the application of technology for data collection, processing, and analysis?
Okay, thank you. So I think we've started seeing very good examples of how the private sector can support, especially with the new registration and the fact that now the telecom sector can actually help register Nigerians rather than having to wait in a very long line to get this done. So this is just an example. But before I talk about how the private sector can help with technology, another thing I would also want us to note is the fact that while technology is good, it is not an end in itself. We can't decide to bolt on technology to processes that are currently not working. So first of all, we have to look internally at the processes, at the structures available, and see how those processes and structures work, and then we can begin to think of how technology can support appropriately. Because if not, we will be facing the same problems we are having now. Now, with the private sector, and I think the whole idea here is the fact that it would be great and truly great if we can have one unified data system in the country, maybe not Lagos, maybe in Lagos State, maybe in the country, because right now you have multiple data collection platforms. You go here, they ask for BVN, go here, they ask for another set of information, and you keep providing the same information on multiple platforms. So first of all, it would be great if we can have a unified platform, and then it would make it easier for the private sector to be able to plug in to a structure or a system, that would actually provide the right data for the government to use for decision making. So with other areas that we can consider, for instance, with the private sector, is how also can the public sector or the government now also provide incentives, or I'll use the word instruments, maybe not incentives, to the private sector to be able to fuse in, and support the structure. So, for instance, Dr. Ken has talked about policies. Yeah, there are some laws that can make it maybe not mandatory for the private sector to be able to use their structures to help or support the public sector in data collection. There could be instruments like partnership with public-private partnership on various platforms that could also help the public sector. Another thing I think I would also want to note is the fact that while the public sector collects most of this data, healthcare, I would say most of the data collected, healthcare and environmental data and all of that, the private sector, because of the work that we do, because of our various sectors, we are also privy to a lot of information that is currently not being harnessed by the public sector. And it's really an issue and a gap. At the national level, for instance, we have the SDG reports, that is usually collated by the Office of the Senior Special Assistant to the President on SDGs. While, they collect data from the private sector, but what is really that tool or link between the kind of data that we have and the kind of information at the end of the day that they're able to, aggregate and produce? So this conversation really around how the private sector and public sector can work together is really about having this open, transparent process and system, having consultations, discussing around tools, tools of reporting, how, and if possible, creating that structure and platform and instruments that would enable the private sector to continually feed the public sector with the relevant information that it needs. At the end of the day, we would also avoid a lot of duplicated efforts, a lot of duplicated information, because that is going on even within the private sector. And then we, generally the public sector, I think, should also step in to create those platforms and structures that would help to eliminate some of these issues and challenges that we currently have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mrs. Charlton. She has talked on how the private sector can actually partner with Lagos State in ensuring that there is a regime of open data, and also to make sure that there is a unified platform for data management and reporting. Because without data, without credible data that's based on facts, it's going to be very difficult to measure sustainability and report on that. I'm going to go back to Dr. Shino in Lagos. I'm going to ask you the same question, but also based on your expert background in development finance, in international development, I want you to touch base on the role of technology in this for data management and analysis as well, and also to provide us with your closing remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me first start off by saying that for the government needs to have what I would describe as an e-governance policy. That is a policy that will drive the responsibilities and the parameters for success of deploying technology to ensure that government is more capable, more accountable, and more responsive to the people. Within this policy, you have things like data protection and certain rules and regulations, which the private sector too can now piggyback on. And then within the government itself, there must be a regime of both vertical and horizontal policy coherence. That is the fact that the Ministry of Agric is the Ministry of Agric does not mean it shouldn't meet the same standards of collecting information from the Ministry of Health. Because at the end of the day, all this data needs to be triangulated and reintegrated. The role of technology per se is to help us do things probably faster, more efficiently, to be able to process information in larger quantities, to be able to deploy them faster. But for the purposes of which we're here, these days people also collect information in real time. You see, so it is technology that can help you develop things like early warning systems, both in terms of conflict, both in terms of environment. Because with the speed of technology, you can know when something is coming and you can take steps ahead of time. But it also presumes that you yourself must master the technology, right? You must master the technology in its hardware form, and you should be able to be a creator of applications to meet your own needs. So our investment in, in incubation, like the co-creation hubs of this world, ensuring that is vibrant and is happening, that goes without saying. The most important thing that I think we need to take away from this is, where do we put our efforts now? Resources are so limited. and there's much we can do. First of all, I think we need to reprioritize, which I've said. We don't need to go out of Lagos State has a trajectory of development that all it needs to do is to build on, monitor better, and ensure that it uses a framework that suits its own needs. I think that we should engage the private sector more so that they can understand what we call this triple bottom line, and also use it as an opportunity to identify new opportunities for private sector in things like the green economy, in things like human development and human capacity building. And of course, I will mention in security as well. Truth be told, it was the private sector that helped to salvage Lagos State security situation between 1999 and 2003. So the same kind of way we mobilize private sector, right, and the generators of such technology is how we should mobilize for sustainability. In closing, for me, apart from appreciating the opportunity to share my thoughts, I think Lagos State should do things differently from what it had been doing before. It's not a question of how much we do. The more Lagos does, and the more challenges are elsewhere, the more you attract a population. I don't think Lagos should aspire to be 80 million people by 2030. I think it's going to be a disaster. What Lagos State needs to do is to manage its population and keep it manageable, support other states to be as efficient in communication, governance, monitoring and evaluation, and provision of some services. Nigeria as a whole should aspire to have 6 or 7 hubs of sustainability. And that is why I'm urging all state governors to prioritize SDG 11. Because Lagos State, there are so many conditions that will determine the welfare of Lagos State are going to operate outside Lagos State. So it's a question of building partnerships. Lagos State needs to build partnerships within itself, private sector partnerships, civil society partnerships. Lagos State needs to renew its partnership with the federal government for regulatory reasons and for areas where they have complementarities. Lagos State needs to renew its partnership with development partners based on a renewed or redefined set of priorities. And of course, Lagos State needs to renew its partnership within states within its zone, the southwest zones, as buffer. For me, the integration of all this can be done by good data, good analysis, good integration, and good partnerships. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that insightful closing. And like Riley mentioned, it's good that you actually emphasize SDG 11 on smart cities, sustainable cities. And interesting fact really is that Nigeria as a country, really, we actually need at least 6 to 7 mega cities so as to reduce the pressure on Lagos. And like Riley mentioned, partnership is key. And also there is need for good data integration. Prof, over to you. Your closing remarks. Secretariat, can you unmute Prof?
Okay, they have done so now, yeah. Thank you very much again. And I think it's been an interesting conversation, and I've learned a lot from my colleagues here. I'll still build on the issue of partnerships, but kind of extending it a bit. Dr. Sheena spoke about the government to government kind of a relationship, and also with development partners and civil society. One area I would emphasize in terms of collaboration or partnership is with academia, right? And this will be including, say, institutions in Lagos State, as well as looking further afield. And the collaboration can also be quite specific. Since we are talking about SDG data measurement and reporting today, and we have also agreed that data is important, technology is important. So the question for me is, how do we move from talk to action? How do we move from talk to practice? And what would it mean for Lagos State? A critical capability I think Lagos State needs to further enhance is around data capability, data management capability. How can Lagos become the hub for that kind of expertise in Nigeria? And how can the academia, so you have University of Lagos, you have Lagos State University, you have Yaba Technology, School of Technology, and so on and so forth. So how can they all collaborate to help Lagos State to achieve and enhance this capability? And it might also be worthwhile to think about partnering with foreign institutions. The University of Edinburgh, for example, has one of the best centers of informatics in Europe, if not the world. So when it comes to informatics, University of Edinburgh is top. So how can the University of Edinburgh, for example, support UNILAG, or LASU, or even Lagos State? And sometimes this support may not necessarily be expensive, because development aids now, especially through the UK, is going through research and the universities. So how can we benefit from that? And it's not expensive in that sense. So it's not that it will cost the Lagos an arm and a leg. For instance, the University of Edinburgh at the moment is championing the idea of data, SDG data gaps in Nigeria, and it's coming through a research grant, and I'm leading it through in collaboration with Ernst & Young. And so we have a series of workshops coming up end of this month and beginning of next month. So these are opportunities there for true collaborations for capacity building. So I would like to leave it there to say, well, it's good to attend conferences like this. We talk, but we need to move to action. And that's where I'm coming in. And when it comes to action, there are already partners that are willing to work. Sometimes it's difficult to get the right access. I'll be happy, for example, to be introduced to the person in charge of Lagos State Bureau of Statistics, because it will be important in the conference we are holding, or in the workshop, actual workshop, but I don't have access there. So these are some of the things we need to start talking, so that if I leave here today, next week I'm really getting my hands dirty to work with people who want to truly imbibe whatever we discuss here and move talk to action. So I will leave it there. But thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Kenneth. Quite insightful closing comments. And like you rightly mentioned, partnership with the academia is very important, as being done in other parts of the world. Because of time, we would have loved to take more questions, but maybe once we have the closing remarks from Mrs. Sholoton, maybe you can also use your closing remarks to talk about how Lagos State, you've talked about the collaboration anyway. I think that's actually what the question is, is a comment. Let's have your closing remarks first. Maybe we can now get the participant to make that comment afterward. Mrs. Sima, your closing remarks, please.
Okay, thank you. And thank you again for the opportunity. In closing, I think what I need to highlight here is the fact that the public sector, the government, they need to walk the talk. If we want to ensure proper impact reporting to attract financing, if we want to put in place the right policies, we must ensure that internally we have the right structure, enabling environment, technology in place. If we engage, we have all of the partnerships, and then when it's time for implementation, various stakeholders had to face a lot of challenges, then it really defeats the entire purpose. So what I would expect to see, and this platform is really great in really showing how and ways that we can collaborate. But I would expect to see more going forward from the public sector and the government around 4 major areas. One is around awareness raising. There are various information platforms just to show that really that the government is really interested and they're all in when it really comes to we talked about the triple bottom line or what we call sustainability reporting or accounting, and there are different ways that it can be done. Secondly, we've talked about partnering. There are multi-stakeholder involvement, there's public-private partnerships, there's collective action, there are roundtables, that we could have around these conversations, really also, just to put action into all of the various ideas that we have. Thirdly is around having what I would call soft laws. What kind of codes, can we put in place, guidelines, such that even the government, is ready to adhere, and then it makes other stakeholders within the state have no other choice but to also, support and adhere. And then the last, which may be not so supportive from the voluntary aspect of it, is kind of also mandating. Mandating, this kinds of activities or reporting or measuring collection system, and if possible, even putting penalties. One area that we didn't necessarily talk about today in all of this collection of data is also with privacy of data. The government needs to also understand that that is a human right of every citizen, and is even a public service in itself. So as we collect, as we analyze, as we deliver, we need to be very conscious of the fact that we are using actual people, individual information, and privacy must be protected at all costs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Charlton, and very important last point that you made there, data privacy. In the UK and Europe, there is this GDPR to ensure that people's data are quite private, and you are actually spot on that. You also emphasize multi-stakeholders partnership, and just like Prof. Kenneth mentioned, we need to move from talk to action. It's about implementation. I think we have a comment from a live audience in Lagos. Secretariat, if we still have 1 minute to have Mr. Oluwatobiloba Kindugate Foundation. Can you make your comment in 1 minute? Secretariat? Do we still have the live audience that wants to make comment?
Yes, my name is Tayo Seniokwe, Director, Lagos Bureau of Statistics from the Ministry of Economic Planning and Budget. For the attention of the Professor Kenneth, I will leave my contacts with the Secretariat to further disseminate to you, sir. My comment is about this conference is like an exposure, it's a value added, and state government, they are making some things around some of the suggestions, and what we are looking at is to be more coordinated and put things in the right perspective. However, the review of the Lagos State Development Plan is just, they just kick-started it between 2021 to 2050, I think so. And they are working around, and they are planning to use high-level documents like the SDGs, like team's agenda, all those things they want to synchronize, and particularly from the lessons learned on the last development plan of 2012 to 2025, as Uncle Shino mentioned, that there was no MIE as a trigger to support that document. I think it's a great lesson. It was a great lessons learned, and that is key in moving forward to ensure this policy document is being developed for the state as for Greater Lagos. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for that remarks. In closing, I would like to appreciate Dr. Shino. Thank you for your time and insight on sustainability, measurement, and reporting. Professor Kenneth, we appreciate your insight as well. And as in terms of response from Lagos State, we will move to talk to action as indicated by the representative from the Bureau for Statistics. Mrs. Shima Shuloton, thank you for your contributions from the private sector, and most importantly, and your point on data privacy, because the reality really is that data is the new oil in the area of big data, artificial intelligence. We don't want a scenario whereby data privacy or people will sell other people's data. That is actually something that needs to be considered. So with that, I would like to close this session, and it's been a very insightful conversation. We thank the organizers and Betty for putting this together. And for all the participants, those who are on Zoom and also on YouTube, thank you for listening, and we'll bring this breakout session to a close. Thank you.